Hi, everyone, and very warm welcome to the first webinar in our summer series. We're delighted to have you with us today, and it's a pleasure and honor to welcome Professor Stuart Murray, whose work continues to shape and challenge the ways we think about disability, embodiment, vulnerability, and the lived experience of health. Professor Murray is Professor of Contemporary Literature in the School of English at the University of Leeds in the UK. He is the author of 6 monographs, most recently Medical Humanities and Disability Studies in Disciplines in 2023, and Disability and the Posthuman Bodies, Technology and Cultural Futures 2020, and the co-editor and editor of 5 other books. He has written widely on the interrelations of disability, embodied technology, cultural theory, and health in literature and film from across the 20th and 21st centuries. So thank you all for joining us. Now I will hand over to Professor Stuart Murray.
Thank you very much, Arya. Can I just echo your thanks as well to everyone who's joined? Just one other quick check with you, Arya, that the screen looks fine and it's got the large front slide at the start there.
We can see the screen, but we can't see. We can see you. I can see you and the screen, but
Okay.
not other slides.
No, that's fine. But if I move on, can you see the next one?
Yes.
Okay, that's fine. I can't see anyone, so apologies for that. It's often the way when you're sharing screen. Yes, I'm really pleased to be here. Thank you so much for the introduction. I was looking a bit earlier at some of the previous talks and the ones to come that are in the series, and it's wonderful company to be keeping. It's a great resource, a great set of talks that you've had over the winter and now into the summer, and I'm really, really pleased to be part of it. So that top slide shows the title of my talk, Touching Sleep, Immersed Process, Dispersed Object, Situated Vulnerability. As I go, I'm going to explain what those various terms means and hopefully give a good amount of detail to each one so you'll know what I'm doing. First, I would want to say I'm really grateful to Arya because when he first got in touch and asked me to give a paper, I took on board that it was literature and science, and I said, well, look, the thing I've been working on recently isn't especially literary, but it's very much medical humanities. And so he was good enough to say that's absolutely fine, because it doesn't necessarily have to have a focus on the literature. What I have done, though, is I built quite a lot more of a literary framing into the work, and I'll explain what I'm talking about as I go on. One thing I would say is I really do see the project I'm about to talk about as very much one situated in the medical humanities. It draws a lot from ideas of science and medicine and embodiment and things that come from all parts of the different subject areas that I find so valuable in medical humanities. The Touching Sleep work came out of the Living Bodies Objects project, which hopefully you can see details of on your screen. That was a 3.5-year project. It is just coming to its end that did many, many things. But one of the things that it did was it looked at and invited experimental and playful research around the things that were made possible by the conjunction of those 3 words, living bodies and objects. And so what I'm going to be talking about is sleep in relation to those 3 terms. But please, if you're interested in living bodies objects, do give it a Google and go to our website because it's a great resource for all sorts of things that we did. Hopefully what you're seeing now is an art object that we made. And I wanted to show it at the start because what I'm going to do now is explain the processes by which we managed to make this. So it shows a grid of 4x8 tiles, each of which has been engraved with a spiral. And at the front, there's a box which is open to show on the bottom left, a place where a hand would go, on the top right, a stylus, and at the bottom right, a place where a tile could be put and engraved. I understand that that is a bit cryptic at the moment, but that is the product we made, the artwork we made in touching sleep, and I want to explain how we got there. Just want to check again, Aria, that everybody can see that, you can see that.
Yes.
Okay. To work on sleep involves quite a few contradictions. The first one of which is that most work on sleep is about not sleeping. Much that is written about sleep, particularly in the arts, humanities, and social sciences, is in fact about the absence of sleep. It's often about insomnia, and what I've pulled up here are just two of many titles, in fact, which speak to sleeplessness. So they are two recent examples of novels which are speculative fiction that explore ideas of sleeplessness, particularly in the context of things like a post-apocalypse catastrophe. So both those novels came under the kind of really interesting category over the last 15 years of pandemic literature, where something like sleeplessness was a virus in a post-apocalypse, and where the sleepless often were doomed either to pass the virus on to others and to die, or to try and find ways to restore sleep. And it's a classic example, possibly the most overt example I can think of, is where the topic of sleep is dealt with, as I say, through its absence. So sleeplessness is very much something prevalent in contemporary fiction. And it's not just fiction. Here's two other books, basically, with the same title. On the left, Jim Horn's book Sleeplessness, with its subtitle Assessing Sleep Need in Society Today, which is a sociological study of ideas such as sleep poverty and the asserted absence of sleep and lack of sleep that is affecting so many people across the globe, and the idea of what is needed to make sleep better. So here, sleeplessness is seen as a consequence of an evolving society that puts so much pressure on wakefulness, and I'll talk a little bit more about this in a moment, that sleeplessness is becoming the norm. The book on the right was one that was really important to the work I ended up doing on sleep. A book, again, called Sleepless by the French writer Marie Darrieussecq, which is a wonderful, impressionistic and creative essay based around her own chronic insomnia, and explores the same insomnia in many, many writers, particularly across the last 200 years. And because Darrieussecq is French, the focus in the book is on French writers. So she talks, for example, about Marcel Proust, about Victor Hugo, about Marguerite Duras, and there's a wonderful reading of multiple texts. Again, where for writers it seems that it is not the sleep, but the absence of sleep, which is most interesting. The insomnia that produces work or insight or inspiration. Two more sleep books, which I think speak to this idea again that we are in a sleep crisis. So Roger Urquick's History of Nighttime, A Day's Close, to the left, and to the right, a really quite influential book by Jonathan Crary, the art historian, called 24/7. So both of these interrogate, again, this idea that the contemporary world has experienced a sleep crisis, that we're all sleeping less and we're all sleeping worse. And this is because the pressures put on us, particularly in terms of productivity and efficiency. So I've put up a couple of lines, one from each book. I particularly like the Crary one, where he says that within this logic of productivity and efficiency within the global neoliberalist paradigm, sleeping is for losers. And he's got a wonderful bit where he follows on from that quotation, and he simply says, because you don't produce anything when you sleep. And if we live in a world where everybody is measured by their production, then sleeping is pointless. And Urquick says a similar thing, that within a contemporary, society, sleep becomes a structured attention deficit, a systemic anomaly in humans. And these are other examples of the notion of an absence of sleep. I'm very much committed, and you can maybe get an idea of it from the title of this talk. I'm very much committed to a kind of provocative idea of how you might be able to touch sleep, how you might be able to talk about the materiality of sleep. So to find so much work which is about the absence of sleep, I saw as a challenge. Now, my current writing project is a book about sleep and modernism. So I've been reading a lot of modernist literature, looking for moments where sleep happens, trying to plot how sleep in literature can be mapped onto and interwoven with the developments in sleep technology between around 1900 and 1940, where there were incredible movements in the way in which sleep was understood, started to be mapped. So, for example, EEG was an invention of the 1920s, which led to better ways to find out how sleep happened in the brain, those kinds of things. The relationship between those technological innovations and modernist writing. There are so many examples when I was looking around earlier of trying to find really good takeaway lines from modernist writing. Just to share with you, and I ended up thinking I could only really use one slide because I could go into far too many slides that would be useful. So I just pulled some up, which gives certain examples of the way sleep was discussed and presented in modern literature. So there are particular traits here. So when Woolf writes in The Common Reader that sleep is that deplorable curtailment to the joy of life, and similarly, where Wallace Stevens says in his poem, Hymn from a Watermelon Pavilion, of the two dreams night and day, what lover, what dreamer would choose the one obscured by sleep? In both of those, we have this idea that sleep curtails, that sleep obscures, that again, it's a problem. It's a obstruction to activity that it would be better to be doing. So in those two moments, sleep is not something you might think that you would want to do. Woolf paints it as being joyless. And that notion, very common to all those writers who suffered from insomnia that Darius Seck talks about, is that writers kept coming back to the opportunities presented by insomnia to find inspiration to work, to stop this curtailment, to stop this obscuring. But the second idea that comes in the Kafka quotation down the bottom is this carnage of insomnia. He writes in his diaries, there's been a recent wonderful translation by Ross Benjamin of the full extant Kafka diaries that hadn't existed before in English. He writes in October 1911, sleepless night, the third in a row. I fall asleep easily, but after an hour I wake up as if I had laid my head in a false hole. I'm completely awake, have the feeling of not slept at all or only under a thin skin, have the work of falling asleep ahead of me anew and feel rejected by sleep. I think of all the figures I'm reading at the moment, of all the people who are making me think about modernism and sleep, Kafka is the one to whom I keep returning. A chronic insomniac, a person who worked through the insomnia to really think that his writing was best done at night when it was impossible for him to sleep. These and other moments from a similar time in the diaries are always talking about the problems of sleeping. What's really interesting about Kafka is he writes a story called The Judgment, which is often seen by many critics as one of the very first story in which he achieved his kind of mature form of writing. He wrote that story, The Judgment, in one night, in one sleepless night, from late in the evening to early in the morning. And he himself said that it was as if being able to do that, being able to make that process of sleeplessness allowed him to achieve the creativity that he wanted. So all of these in many ways are issues of sleep as a certain kind of problem. And we might recognize them because everybody I've found has a sleep story of one way or another. When I was thinking more about modernism and touch and sleep, I found myself returning to one place, I think, where we can visualize sleep and maybe touch. So you may well know The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Robert Wiene's film from 1920. And this famous scene, one of the most famous scenes in cinema, a great modernist moment, where we might say that we come close to seeing what touching sleep might be. The sleeping heroine, Jane, the somnambulist, violent predator, Cesare, and the moment in which he comes to attack her before he stops and then actually abducts her rather than kills her. And it's a moment, I think, where we can see some of those words that I tried to explain in the subtitle of my talk, particularly vulnerability. The vulnerable Jane, and the way in which here sleep gives no protection from without, gives no protection to the way in which you might be attacked. So here then is a way into sleep touch. And there are critically things to talk about here as well. So a couple of really useful quotations that I like, two thoughts. The first is from Matthew Wolfe-Meyer's wonderful book, The Slumbering Masses, Sleep Medicine and Modern American Life, which is a kind of anthropological, cultural, historical, very, very multidisciplinary investigation of the place of sleep in American life. And what Wolfe-Meyer does really well is understand the incredible, strange, wonderful complexity of sleep. He says, attending to the always changing nature of sleep in everyday life destabilizes them as inert, explanatory objects, and instead renders them complex processes binding past, present, and future in irreducible ways. So if Virginia Woolf and others thought sleep was really quite a straightforward thing that got in the way of activities that curtailed and obscured life, then Wolfe-Meyer points out, I think, really quite straightforwardly and accurately that in fact what we're talking about are extraordinarily complex processes, particularly around, I think, an important element of sleep that we should always acknowledge, that it is every day. The second quotation is from Laura Marx's wonderful book about touch and sensuous theory. And she writes, if every object and event is irreducible in its materiality, then part of learning to touch it is to come to love its particularity, its strangeness, its precious and inimitable place in the world. And I think if I found myself putting those two together, those two quotations together, the complex processes of everyday sleep and the way in which to learn to touch the everyday object is to come to love its particularity and its strangeness, I found a way into this notion of sleep and touch. I was very much driven by working with two creative artists and technologists on the Living Bodies Object team, Dave Lynch and Christophe de Biznac. And what the three of us did was try to work out ways in which we could see the notion of sleep and a living body as an object that we could think of together in the kind of terms that we're getting from these two quotations here. Is it possible to touch something that's so complex as this? So what I'm going to do now is move on to talk about the production of the artwork, the box and the tiles that I showed at the start. And hopefully you'll begin to see how all of these ideas that I've been speaking about with regard to sleep come together. Looking for inspiration of this idea about how to touch sleep. Well, there's been quite a lot of work on sleep and arts, particularly pertinent to the work we were doing in the contemporary period. There are, of course, wonderful sculptures, especially from antiquity, and paintings from down the centuries which show people asleep, and there's much to say about that. We were particularly interested in the relationship between sleep and technology, not just the technologies of sleep, but the technologies of recording sleep. So here are a couple of quite famous examples of sleep being filmed. Sleep, the film on the left by Andy Warhol, is in fact the first film that Warhol ever made, and is over 5 hours, a looping film of his lover asleep. It's rather intriguing because when he made the film, Warhol did not know properly how to get the film in and out of the camera. So it's got all sorts of moments of repetition that came from him just learning how to use the camera. The film on the right is called Coming Home, and it's a film that Sam Taylor Johnson made of David Beckham. Nearly 2 hours of him just asleep. What interests me about watching those films came with the quotation that's above them. Wonderful book on techno-sleep. Techno-sleep is the word used quite broadly now to describe the interaction between sleep and technology, and the way in which that is becoming more and more of an interweaving of processes with things such as wearables and the various ways in which we're told we need to use technologies in order to sleep better. And in that book, which is multi-authored, we just get this line, although we feel sleep, we can't touch it, taste it, and hear it. And we took that as a challenge in touching sleep to see whether these things were possible. I think an interesting thing is that you might say, we may not be able to touch, taste, and hear our own sleep, but we can certainly see and hear the sleep of others. I think the touching, though, was the thing that still seemed difficult to address and get to. We can't touch the characters in the films by Warhol and Taylor Johnson. We can view them from without. We can ask, what are we invited to think when we watch films of people who are asleep like this? There's an inherent vulnerability. There is also at the same time an idea of surveillance. And then there are the artistic processes by which the films themselves are made. A more recent example that might bring you closer to touch, maybe, is this art piece, The Maybe, in which Tilda Swinton, the actor and artist, slept in a plastic box, first at the Serpentine Gallery in London in 1995, and then it was revived as a larger piece, by which I mean it was had more visitors, in MoMA in New York in 2013. So here those questions of surveillance and vulnerability, I think, still pertain, but you are actually closer to a real human being. And you can see, I think, even in the picture there, the dynamics of looking at sleep and being close to it. These are the things that came close to some of the things we were trying to do in our project. Possibly the closest artwork to that which we were trying to produce comes in the absolutely fantastic work of Susan Morris. What Morris did was, for the best part of 5 years from 2010 onwards, was she used a wearable technology to record every moment of her sleep and waking. And she took the data from all of that and put it into a loom and wove tapestries made of silk and cotton. And she put these together, and in these fantastically large pictures, sorry, they're not pictures, they are tapestries, that remind, I think, anybody who sees them of abstract expressionism. There's a kind of Mark Rothko vibe to them. And had them on the wall of a gallery in Switzerland in a fantastic show. And the piece was called Sundial Night Watch. So it was an account, a way of engaging with her movements during the day and her movements at night, in which the data was made into these tapestries that are fundamentally full of orange and yellow and blue weaves of silk and cotton. That gave us the idea of maybe a way to use data to turn sleep into something that was touched. Because again, although Morris is making this wonderful artwork here, this is not necessarily something that you can touch, but it's something produced by technology that is a depiction of sleep. Part of this, to go back to what I said before, is admitting to the notion of sleep being incredibly ordinary and incredibly everyday. And I've always been taken by Kathleen Stewart's book, Ordinary Affects, about the way in which ordinary can suddenly become strange when we're forced to think of an ordinary object in a different way. And Stewart calls the ordinary a kind of contact zone where the overdetermination of circulations, events, conditions, technologies, and flows of power literally take place, that they become more fractious, simplicitous, and unpredictable than symbolic meanings. So it's a kind of way in which there's an over signaling of the ordinary in all of those ways in which Stewart describes it there, all of those manifestations. And that idea, I think, of taking the ordinary and making it different was central to the work we wanted to do around sleep. We wanted to stress it as an ordinary activity made multiple. And in our own work, this included these ideas of dispersed sleep, sleeping for others rather than yourself, more than human sleep, and the body as an object among other objects. So we came up with this idea that I would sleep and I would do 8 sleeps during the day. The data from those sleeps would be recorded, and we would use that data to work through technological means that would make the artworks that you saw at the beginning of the talk. So here, for example, to put this into a bit of a detail, is the output of the first sleep that I did. So overall, I did 8 sleeps. They were roughly 1 hour each. They were all across the working day. So rather than have a night's sleep, which is the usual way in which sleep is recorded and tested, the notion was to have 8 hours sleep, so classically a good night's sleep, but split into single 1 hour sleeps, again, I stress, across the working day. Part of that idea of the working day was to play somewhat around the idea of exhaustion during work, but also the provocation of what it's like to sleep during the day. So I slept in 3 different places. This first sleep took place in the Living Bodies Object Laboratory, which was in the Health Sciences Library at the University of Leeds. But I also slept in my office at the university, and I slept at home. For each sleep, I wore an E4 wearable, which is a research grade piece of technology that records far more than the average one that you might be able to buy and use to test your own sleep. They're very expensive. They cost around about £2,000, if that gives a sense of what we're looking. And it captured many more aspects of sleep than your standard wearable will. So just to explain very briefly what the different things you can see on the screen are. The top one is the galvanic skin response. So the amount of electricity produced by my skin during the sleeping process. The second one is blood volume. The middle ones are to do with heart rate variation, which is the most important one I'll come back to. And the bottom one is my temperature. So you can see, I hope, quite clearly that I fell asleep during the middle portion of what's represented here on the graph. What happened was, when I woke up, most of the time when you wear a wearable to track your sleep or activity, the data is immediately sent to you on your phone, say. We had set it up so the data was not sent to me, it was sent to Christoph and Dave. So in effect, I was sleeping for them. I was sleeping in order that they might know what my sleep had been like. And Dave has this really interesting thing where he says to me that he was able, following the data as it came in real time during the sleep, he was able to see when I was going to wake up before I did. The heart rate variation is the important one because it's that which fluctuates around the autonomic nervous system, which is the way in which the body regulates involuntary functions like heart rate, blood pressure, respiration, and digestion. So, whoops, sorry. The ANS basically has 2 modes, a kind of fight and flight. And we were looking to record the heart rate variation in order to be able to speak to the ways in which my body was vulnerable at the point of sleeping. What we then did, and here I think we can get back to the images that I showed at the start and explain them a little bit more. What we then did was find a way to convert that data into a magnetic force. So if you look at the picture on the right, the box, when you open it, has a matrix of 9 hand-wound electromagnetic coils, each of which is connected to a pulse width modulating controller, and they're arranged in a 3x3 pattern. And they cover the area of the wax tile, which is situated above them. So we use open sound control software, and we use the variations in my heart rate across the different sleeps to provide a magnetic pushback. So in other words, when the volunteers who came to inscribe the tiles, and they were other members of the LBO research team, when they came to make the tiles that are the fundamental part of the artwork, they were having to work with and against the magnetism, which was the product of my sleep data. So what you see here is the process of engraving. So the engravings were done across a series of 5.5-inch square black wax-coated tiles. Each one represented a single sleep, and they form part of the complete final piece. So the tiles are a mix. We spent a long time trying to work out how they might be mixed together. 60% oil, 20% beeswax, 20% charcoal, painted in 3 layers before being smoothed out through the use of a heat gun. The tiles were given to each member of the team, and they tried to draw as tight a spiral as they could across the different variations of magnetic pushback that they had. The results were intriguing, I think. And so this is just a kind of detail. So you can see how here some of the spirals look relatively recognizable as concise spirals, whereas others, the bottom right hand is a good example, were more difficult to draw. And the irregularity of the tiles were created by this pushback of the calibrated magnetic force. And it was really interesting to speak to our colleagues. We interviewed them and filmed them as they made the spirals. They were very aware that the origin for the sleep had come from myself, had come from my own sleep practice. But what they were finding was, as well as trying to touch the charcoal and the oil slides, they were also touching a pushback that was produced by the conversion of the data of my own sleep. So it was like those Susan Morris paintings that we were showing, except for it was more hands-on. It was like the creation of the pattern could only be done by a direct touch engagement with my sleep. I love this book by Mark Patterson, The Senses of Touch, about haptics and affect and technology, because he points out that touch is crucial to embodied existence. It possesses a complex constitution, being a singular sense that corresponds to no single organ. Physiologically, touch is a modality resulting from the combined information of innumerable receptors and nerve endings concerned with pressure, temperature, pain, and movement. But there is more to touch. It is a sense of communication. It is receptive, expressive, can communicate empathy. It can bring distant objects and people into proximity. And I especially love that last line, because I think with the Touching Sleep project, we were trying precisely to do that. We were trying to bring something that seems distant, the sleep of others, maybe your own sleep as experienced by others. We were trying to bring that into the proximity that can be made, as Patterson says here, by touch. There are so many complex issues in contemporary sleep. There are so many sleep disorders. There are so many sleep problems around the globe. Sleep in the global south has very little research done into it. Most sleep research concerns sleep as understood across Europe and America, because that is where a lot of the technology that's now used in sleep measurement originated from. We run a real risk, I think, of not understanding what sleep is, what it does, and the best way we can speak of it and engage with it. And so for us, touching sleep was a way to enact communication in the ways that Mark Patterson is talking about here, and also to exemplify, if I can call it that way, the point that Laura Marks made earlier about the kind of wonderful processes of creativity and engagement that come through touch. So the piece that we've written is going to be published in a wonderful collection that's coming out, edited by Diletta De Cristofaro, which is Sleep and Its Meanings, and it's a collection of essays which are from across the disciplines of what's now being called critical sleep studies, arts, creative arts, sleep science, neurology, psychology, history, a whole variety of things. And that's with MIT Press in Boston, and will be out hopefully the end of this year, but definitely the beginning of next year, if not that. And so I thought, as just a final slide on which to sign off, there's this fabulous poem called A Good Night by William Cullis Williams that starts with that. And I'm very taken with that idea that I could say to everyone listening, make sure you go to sleep, but of course you won't. So Aria, that's me finished.
Thank you very much. I would like to extend my sincere thanks for your very lucid talk. Your talk was both intellectually stimulating and deeply thought-provoking. I truly appreciate the way you navigated the complex interplay between embodiment and the porous boundaries of sleep. So thank you again for sharing your research and insights, and I really look forward to exploring more of your work.